Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of my favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and in this episode, we're diving back into Telltale Games' The Walking Dead, this time making our way into Season 2. In case you missed the previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Season 2, Episode 1 of Telltale Games' The Walking Dead dropped just in time for Christmas in 2013. Initial reviews of the episode and overall season were positive, though there has since been some debate and controversy around the story in general. For this video, as in previous iterations, I'll be staying focused on the choices in the game and what would be right and wrong morally. But once we're officially wrapping up the series in Season 4, I'll be coming back to talk more about the game, including the writing and storytelling. Season 2 opens a few months after the end of Season 1. With Lee no longer in the picture, we take up the reins as Clementine, and we see her, a very pregnant Krista, and Omid making their way toward what remains of a public restroom. While the two adults make their way into the men's restroom, Clem follows Omid's suggestion and heads to the door into the women's side. Right away, this seems odd because you would think that they would want to clear the building, making sure no one was hiding inside, before going in. As capable as Clementine is, seeing neither adult take a moment to check the building before she entered it alone is unnerving. That qualm aside, it also strikes me as incredibly odd that they didn't take turns while someone kept watch. They've been together for a while, and they've all seen the problems that can arise when their guard is dropped. Why wouldn't they be taking what should be some basic precautions at this point? Their lack of vigilance bites them, as Clementine finds herself at the wrong end of her own gun when a teen girl enters the restroom she had been cleaning up in. Trying to hide doesn't work, as the girl finds you and forces you out of the stall that you're in. And things just get worse when Omid comes in to see if Clem is okay. Panicking, the young woman turns and fires a shot without even stopping to think, and Omid falls to the floor just as Krista enters. Without hesitation, Krista points her rifle at the young woman and fires a shot, killing the girl as Clementine looks on in shock. And that whole sequence of events is really harder on Clementine than it is for the player, as we weren't given any kind of choice about picking up the gun or leaving it on the counter. It's a decision that, for Clem's part, makes sense, as she was only going to retrieve her water bottle. Grabbing the gun, or at least keeping it within arm's reach, would be easy to forget as she probably felt relatively safe. But it was also a stupid mistake in hindsight because she would have been carrying and taking care of a gun for a while at that point. But we don't get to see the direct fallout as the scene fades and we're sent forward 16 months, reconnecting with Clementine and Krista as they try in vain to get a fire going in what appears to be a light rain shower. Krista is no longer pregnant, but there's no sign of a child, and we can speculate that something happened to it either before or shortly after being born. The relationship between Krista and Clem seems to be strained, but we can't be sure if this is due to recent circumstances or the long-term fallout of Omid's death. A short conversation between them references the cold and reveals that they are attempting to reach a settlement known as Wellington. Wellington will play a bigger role later, but before they get too far into talking about that, Krista wanders off in search of wood, and you get the chance to look around the camp. A picture of Lee, taken from the drugstore in Season 1, and a drawing made by Duck can be found in Clem's backpack as you look around for a lighter. It's these items that really drive home how much Clementine has lost over the course of the first couple of years in this new world. As a side note, it's worth mentioning that the picture of Lee that she has was dropped to the ground by him when Carly surprised him. He might have picked it back up, but I like to think that Clem grabbed it as a way to keep Lee close even when he was out scavenging. Voices in the distance draw Clementine into the dark woods, and she soon stumbles upon Krista being harassed by a group of men. Attempting to distract the men, Clem finds herself running from them as a gunshot rings out behind her. After a race through the dark and a close call with some zombies, Clementine falls down an embankment into a raging river. Somehow surviving the rapids, she wakes to find the sun shining as the current has carried her into the morning, some unknown distance downstream. Making her way Down a nearby path, she comes across a sign that seems to be perfectly placed to remind her that zombies aren't the only things to watch out for in the woods. With a heightened awareness, she plods on and soon finds a furry, four-legged companion in the form of a dog named Sam. His family was camped nearby at some point, and you can find evidence that they survived for a short while in the woods before something ended all of their lives, leaving Sam alone with no one to feed or pet him. Clementine can play frisbee with her new best buddy, but a can of food comes between them. Like Clem, it's likely been a while since Sam had anything good to eat, and when she shares a can of beans she finds in the trash with him, he tries to take more than his share. Clem drops the can, and Sam attacks her when she tries to pick it up, biting her arm and leading to one of the saddest moments of the episode as Sam ends up impaled on some spikes. Part of me really wishes there would have been a way to keep Sam around, as I personally love canine companions. But it isn't possible here, and you have a choice to make. You can let Sam suffer as he slowly dies on the spikes, or you can put him down using a pocket knife you retrieved from the zombified remains of one of his former owners. The humane thing to do here would be to end his suffering. No animal, or person for that matter, should have to suffer like that. After putting the dog down, Clementine resumes her search for Krista, or at least for some sign of an ally. But the woods are crawling with zombies, and she's soon surrounded by the dead. Weak from a lack of food, a ride down a raging river, and now a dog bite on her arm, she nearly passes out and eventually finds herself in a fist fight with a hungry corpse. Her story probably would have ended there if not for the kindness of strangers. As her last ounce of strength is draining, a blade severs the head of the zombie lying on top of her. A man reaches down and frees her before helping her up as arrows being shot by another man take down the zombies in the area. When the dust settles, Clem finds herself in the arms of the younger of the two, who introduces himself as Luke. He and his companion Pete stepped in to help, but they seemed more concerned about who Clementine might have been with. Before they can ask too many questions though, Luke notices the bite on Clementine's arm and drops her without a second thought. She tells them it was a dog bite, but they aren't entirely convinced, even as they agree to let her come back with them to the cabin that their group is staying at. They're nearly there when she passes out, and the sound of several voices arguing about what to do with her brings her back to consciousness. The group is divided, especially as she's only a child, but it isn't just the bite they're worried about. This is the first time we hear them mention the name Carver, but it won't be the last. Some members of the group are worried that Clementine might be a part of another group they're trying to avoid. And they all have doubts about the possibility that a dog bit her. And this is really the first time in the series we're coming in as a true outsider. The closest we've experienced to anything like this is when Lee, Clementine, Kenny, Katja, and Duck were pulled into the drugstore in Macon. But in that circumstance, it was a combination of groups. We've been on the other side of things when trying to figure out what to do with Ben at the motor inn, but he wasn't bit in that instance. Now, it's our turn to ask a group to help us in an impossible situation. After some back and forth, they decide to lock Clementine up in a shed and wait until morning. The argument is that if the bite was from a zombie, she'd develop a fever overnight and they'd know that they need to kill her. But there's a major problem with that thought. Bites from animals can easily become infected, and quick treatment is almost always needed to make sure that doesn't happen. An infection can take root in as little as 8 hours, with proper cleaning and care of the wound being the best way to prevent any issues. Putting ourselves in the shoes of the group, it's understandable that they would hesitate to bring Clementine in and use medical supplies on what could be a fatal bite from a zombie. As we've discussed in other situations, supplies are limited, and using even a small amount on someone who isn't going to live either way is not smart. But would locking her in a shed be better? The reasonable thing to do here would be to clean up the wound using something basic like water and try to determine for sure what bit her. At a minimum, she should be kept in the house under close surveillance and given whatever can be spared. If that's too much, then she should be sent away or killed on the spot. As drastic as either of those options may be, they're both more humane than locking her in a cold shed overnight with a wound that could prove to be fatal even if it didn't come from a zombie. But the group elects to lock her away, and it isn't long before she's breaking out of the shed and into the cabin, in search of basic medical supplies. So now we've gone from begging for help to stealing, an action we've condemned people for in the past. And that's where this group ultimately proves to be more forgiving. After stealing the supplies she needs, with the help of several members inside the cabin, Clem is able to clean and suture her own wound, before a zombie surprises her by coming through a hole in the shed that she used to escape. She's finishing it off as the group opens the doors behind her.
Tough as nails. Are you all right?
I'm still not bitten.
Some of them seem to feel guilty for leaving her out there, and some are more concerned with how she got the supplies. After going into the cabin and having our patchwork assessed by Carlos, we're treated to what is probably Clem's first good meal in weeks. We find out a little bit more about the group as she gets a chance to chat with Luke, and Nick even comes in at one point to apologize for nearly shooting her when she showed up. And let's take a minute here to look at the group from the outside, because this is the first time we've really had the chance to see another group from Clementine's eyes since everything went sideways in Savannah. We've got Luke and Pete, the first members we meet, and two of the more level-headed people we've seen. Then there's Nick, who seems very unsure of himself and whose introduction includes trying to shoot Clem. We find out he was so rough on Clem at first because he'd lost his mother to a bite victim they had been trying to help, and he still blames himself for not doing more in that instance. Alvin helps Clementine by getting her some bandages and a juice box after trying to walk a fine line between putting her in the shed and letting her in the house. Some pushing is required to get him to do this, but it's clear that deep down he really wants to do something to help Clem, despite the scolding he gets from his wife, Rebecca. Rebecca is extremely hot-headed and has clearly been through a lot. She's also pregnant, and while looking through the house for medical supplies, Clementine overhears her in the bathroom, praying that Alvin is the father of the baby. Carlos is the doctor who inspects the bite, but his concern lies less with Clementine's predicament and more on his daughter Sarah. He's been trying to shelter Sarah from the world, hiding as much as he can from her and doing his best to keep her safe. After a good meal and a little rest, Clementine heads out with Pete and Nick at first light to check some fish traps that they'd set up in a nearby creek. As they approach the shore, they discover a massacre. Several bodies are strewn about the bank, with some lying on an island in the middle of the small flow. While investigating, Clementine recognizes one of the men as part of the group that was attacking Krista. He's on the brink of death, and you have the option to give him some water in his final moments, or let him continue suffering. It's clear from the prior interaction we had with him, as short as it was, that he's likely not a very good person. Not only that, he hasn't got more than a few moments left, and giving him anything would be a waste. No matter what you decide, the silence of the moment is interrupted by Pete screaming from the opposite shore as he shoots a zombie that was grabbing his ankle. It's clear something happened, but you've only got a few seconds to react as the gunshot brings the dead from all around. You have one last decision: go with Pete or run back to Nick. Pete seems to be the one more in need of help, and sure enough, Nick leaves you and Pete alone as he runs away when the horde gets to be too much for him. And that's where the episode wraps up. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of my favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and this time we're diving back into Telltale Games' The Walking Dead Season 2, looking at Episode 2. In case you missed Season 1 or any of the other previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 2 is titled A House Divided, and it picks up right where Episode 1 ended. Clementine and Pete find themselves trapped in the back of an old cigarette company van, having barely escaped the zombies at the river, and the reality of the situation quickly sets in as Pete has acknowledged his bite. Unlike characters in a lot of other situations, Pete stays calm and collected as he contemplates removing his leg. The thought of the pain, though, and the fact that Clementine wouldn't be big enough to carry him back after the amputation, keeps him from going through with it. You can choose to give Pete the water that you didn't give the man on the sandbar in episode 1, and you can even provide him with a cigarette to help ease his mind. I'd say the water is an easy choice, given how good Pete has been to Clem. She does owe him her life after all. But the cigarette is just as easy. They might not be good for his health, but neither is a zombie bite, and he only has a matter of hours left anyway. They spend most of the day in silence, with Pete drifting off to sleep at some point, and as the evening moves in, Clementine is starting to fall asleep herself. An odd noise from Pete stirs her awake, and it isn't long before he shouts and starts writhing in pain. As you go to check on him, he stirs and finally wakes up. It's at this point that Pete realizes his own mortality, wanting to live despite knowing he isn't going to make it. He asks Clem to look out for Nick before deciding it's time to take matters into their own hands and escape the truck they've spent the day in. Clementine can convince him that it's worth trying to get back and tell Nick goodbye for himself, but in the end he isn't up for walking much, and Clem has to flee the area on her own as Pete keeps the zombies distracted. Running for her life, Clementine makes it back to the cabin to discover that Luke and Alvin went looking for her, Nick, and Pete hours prior and haven't returned. Carlos and Rebecca are the only adults left, and after hearing about what happened at the river, they too decide to leave. And this is where I want to address something that is really frustrating about this season when it comes to how the characters act. None of the adults seem to have a clue about how to handle any situation, and if it weren't for the maturity of Clementine and her prior experience with Lee, she probably would be in a lot of trouble here. Krista and Omid put their own desires ahead of her, leading to Omid's death. Pete and Luke are able to at least handle the zombies in the woods when they find her, but they are lost as how to handle her dog bite. Alvin, Rebecca, and Carlos all have their own issues to deal with Carlos trying too hard to hide reality from his daughter, Alvin being too afraid of his wife to have any opinions, and Rebecca being more worried about who the father of her child is than being a functional member of the group. And that's not even getting into the problems Nick is having with his confidence. He doesn't trust himself, let alone anyone else, and it causes him to make some bad decisions, like shooting at a scared little girl who's running away. Every adult seems to be lost in their own little world, and they all act like they're only a couple of weeks into the outbreak, when it's really been close to 2 years at this point. Before leaving the cabin, Carlos asks Clementine, the girl that not even 24 hours prior he thought might be involved with a man they've been trying to hide from, to watch his daughter, Sarah. This is just another example of how lost the adults are in this season. When Clementine showed up, the whole group pondered the possibility that she might be affiliated with Carver. In just a few hours, after breaking into the cabin and stealing supplies, she managed to gain their trust. She disappeared with Pete and Nick, returning a few hours later with a story about Pete being bitten, and Carlos's first thought is to go looking for Pete, leaving Clementine home alone with his daughter? If she had been working for Carver, they would be captured before they even had a chance to realize it. They didn't stop to think that maybe she had walked Pete and Nick into a trap? That maybe Carver is waiting just off in the woods for them to come looking for their friends? While we know that Clem isn't working for Carver, they have no way of knowing that. The one thing we really don't know yet is who Carver is. But that's about to change. Clementine goes upstairs to greet Sarah, and she finds the young girl playing with a Polaroid camera. Sarah snaps a photo of Clementine as Clem is walking through the door, and you can choose to take a photo of Sarah in return, or let her take a selfie with the camera. A few moments later, Sarah spots someone, who she assumes is Luke, walking up to the house. As they go downstairs to greet him, however, they realize it isn't Luke at all, but rather some strange man. Before Clem can lock the door, the man opens it and lets himself in. He says his name is George, and though Clementine asks him to leave several times, he proceeds to look through the house. As he's inspecting the upstairs, after seeing a door being shut by Sarah, he discovers the photo the girl had taken of herself lying on the bedroom floor. Now knowing that the people he's looking for have been in the house, the man tells Clementine that the group isn't who she thinks they are, before finally leaving. Throughout the interaction, the man seems to be fairly honest, albeit extremely pushy. He says he's living at a camp nearby, just down the river, and he's fairly straightforward about the fact that he's looking for a group that is very obviously made up of the people Clem has just met. After he leaves, Clem and Sarah sit around and wait for the group to return. Clementine is starting to think they're going to have to go looking for them when they finally come in the back door. Sarah tells them that a man had come by, and everyone starts asking questions about him. It quickly becomes clear that the man is likely Carver, but during the discussion, Sarah says something that stands out. She asks Carlos,
You're not gonna hurt anyone, are you?
This sticks out because if they are running from someone they think is going to hurt them, then why would Sarah think her dad would be the one doing the harm? Luke, replying to Sarah, seems to insinuate Carlos would be capable of hurting Carver, which just adds to the mystery of what happened before Clementine knew these people. As they're deciding to pack up and leave before Carver gets back, you have the chance to ask why they left Carver's camp in the first place, and Carlos just deflects the question by saying that Carver is a bad man. He also insists that Clementine would be safer with the group moving forward, and you wind up leaving the cabin with them. As you walk, Rebecca will apologize to Clem for her recent behavior, and you have a second chance to ask about why they are fleeing Carver. At first, she seems to take it as Clementine asking her personally why he's after her, which stands out when taken in the context of Rebecca's doubts about the fatherhood of her baby. When she finally realizes you were asking about the group as a whole, she dances around the question just like Carlos did, saying only,
It's a long story. He has a hard time letting go.
On the way out of the area, they stop to look for Pete, planning to make sure he's really dead, and they wind up finding what's left of him lying not far from the cigarette truck, with his guts all over and a bullet wound in his head. Clementine notes he didn't have a gun on him, and it becomes clear that someone else must have got to him first. Leaving there, the group heads for the mountains with a 5-day time jump bringing them to a bridge that sits just below a ski lodge. Recognizing the risk of the entire group trying to cross the bridge with no idea of what dangers may lie on or across it, Luke decides that he and Clem should cross first to make sure it's safe. After dealing with some zombies that were upset about not being paid a toll for crossing, the pair find themselves face to face with a stranger whose main concern seems to be whether or not they're assholes. Once it's been established that both sides are more or less friendly, the man offers them some food and shelter before something catches his eye. Coming up behind Clem and Luke is a man with a gun, Nick. Even as they're yelling at him to put the gun down, Nick raises the rifle and fires a shot, striking the man in the jugular and causing him to fall from the bridge. The rest of the group joins them as they scold Nick for being so brash, and they finish crossing the bridge, finding the shelter the man had been talking about. It isn't much, but it's a place to stop and rest for a few moments. Inside the hut the man had apparently been staying in, Clem finds a knife with the initials WM and a couple of cans of food. We also get a little peek into who Alvin really is, as he asks Clementine if she'd be willing to keep the food that they found between them, as Rebecca needs more since she's eating for two. The idea that he would even suggest hiding things from the group is a major red flag on the inner workings of the group as a whole. Rebecca does need more nutrition as her body is working overtime to make a new life, but that should be something the group as a whole is focused on. If Alvin is suggesting hiding the food, it's because he doesn't trust the group to put the needs of a pregnant woman as a high priority. Alvin in general seems to be one of the more trusting members we interact with, so showing that he doesn't trust them says a lot about whether we should. Now, some of the mistrust could be tied to hunger. As we discussed all the way back in Season 1, Episode 2, hunger can make people do and say some crazy things. But given how the group is in general, and has been acting since we met them, it's safe to say that hunger likely isn't the only reason for the mistrust. And it isn't just Alvin who's showing some doubt about the others. A short conversation with Nick, as Carlos and Luke step away for a private discussion, reveals he's worried about how the group sees him, and he doesn't trust them either. He's convinced Carlos and Luke are discussing him, especially as he's just shot someone unprovoked, and he seems jealous of Luke. Before the group can get too comfortable, a herd of zombies coming from the bridge pushes them onward, and they wind up making their way up the mountain to the ski lodge. As they're trying to find a way in and see if anyone else has settled into the lodge, Luke and Clementine head to one of the lift towers, and Clementine climbs up to get a better view of the area. She's able to spot some flashlights down at the bridge they crossed earlier, but before she can tell Luke what she sees, he's pulled away by a commotion on the porch of the lodge. It turns out a group has been staying in the building, and they aren't too happy to see people snooping around. Tensions are climbing as Clem makes her way through the group, but everything comes to a screeching halt when she sees who's arguing for the other side. It's Kenny. The first time I played through, as the series was being released, I thought for sure it was going to be Krista that we were reunited with. Kenny had died down in the alleyway with Ben after all, so I never even considered that he could be the person Clem was surprised to see. I struggled with how to react to seeing Kenny, because on the one hand, he's someone that is tied to Lee and who used to protect Clementine, but on the other, it's been so long in universe since they'd seen each other, and Kenny was closer to Lee than he ever actually was with Clem. He cared for Clementine, and he was good to her overall, but he was more like an uncle than anything else. But I'll be digging deeper into the relationship between Kenny, Lee, and Clementine when we get to Kenny's Friend or Foe episode in a few weeks. Getting back into the moment, the reunion is rather bittersweet, and while Clem is happy to see a familiar face, it's also apparent that, while Kenny has changed, this Kenny isn't a lot different than the Kenny we knew in Season 1. He's met a new woman, Sarita, who saved him when he was at his lowest point, and he's been trying to deal with everything that happened while more or less starting over. Kenny and Sarita have only recently been staying with Walt and Matthew, who were responsible for securing the ski lodge in the first place. Walt is a former teacher, and Clem gets the chance to talk a bit with him while helping prepare dinner. Matthew is Walt's partner, and apparently a free spirit who loves to get out and walk on a regular basis, explaining his absence in the moment. Getting the chance to explore the ski lodge a bit, Clem can help decorate the Christmas tree before making her way up to talk to Carlos, Alvin, and Rebecca. They're in the middle of discussing whether or not Carver would still be tracking them, and trying to decide if it would be safe to stay in the lodge overnight after Clem saw the lights down at the bridge. As they're finishing the conversation, Rebecca starts feeling lightheaded, and Alvin goes off to get her a drink, leaving Clem and Rebecca alone. Rebecca starts talking about the baby and her doubts about whether she'd be a good mom, and she lets Clem feel the baby kick before dropping the bombshell that she doesn't think the baby is Alvin's. While we already knew she had doubts, she seems pretty sure of who the father is as she opens up and shares a fear that telling Alvin would make him hate her. This is another sign of cracks within the group, as while Rebecca apparently hid her feelings from everyone else, she's willing to open up to someone that she's known for only a few days. Some of this might be because Clementine seems like less of a threat and is extremely mature for a child of only 11 years old. But the fact that she hasn't shared any of her doubts or feelings with anyone else in the group speaks to the overall dynamic and lack of trust that she has. And that theme of trust has been really heavy in this episode. The group in general is not trusting of Clementine when she showed up, and they had every reason not to trust her as she stole from them. Carver specifically calls out how the group didn't trust her to begin with when he figures out she's with them. But within a day of meeting her, they seem to trust her more than they trust each other. Nick, Luke, Alvin, and Rebecca all open up to her in ways they seem resistant to do with each other. Some of it could be because of how young and innocent she seems, but the idea that these grown adults would be using her as a therapist and asking her for advice on things, like Rebecca asking her whether or not to tell Alvin about the baby, is insane. The group dynamic is extremely unhealthy, and we can't help but wonder why they're even a group in the first place. Making things worse, Clementine is forced to choose who to eat dinner with. Kenny is sitting at one table with Sarita and Walt, while Luke and the others are sitting at the other table. If you choose to sit with Kenny, Luke gets jealous, and choosing to sit with Luke makes Kenny unhappy. The adults, once again, seem to be incredibly immature and almost seem to be fighting over the affection of an 11-year-old. Both tables have space for her, and it makes the most sense to sit with Luke as that group has been the one she's been a part of recently. Kenny, while being someone Clem knows from the past, is more or less just an acquaintance at this point that she knows no better than Sarita or Walt. Eventually, Kenny comes over and sits with Clem, Luke, and Nick. He tries to make a couple of jokes before the conversation turns to plans and we get a second mention of Wellington. The conversation is a little more tense than it needs to be, and Clem is thrust into the middle of it before Walt comes over and asks Clementine if she could give him a hand outside. As they get outside, he reveals he was trying to help her out of the situation, as he knows it's never fun to be stuck in the middle like that. As they talk, Walt reveals his thoughts on the state of the world and shares a bit of hope in what might be one of the truest sentiments in the series.
They say the world is over, but I'll tell you a secret. It's not. People are more political now than they ever were before. In the end, we can't change the world. All we can do is continue to learn from each other, to empathize, and use our heads.
He also quotes John Steinbeck before referencing the fact that Matthew is working to amass a library. And it's this mention of Matthew that forces Clementine to come to the realization that he might have been the man they met on the bridge. But Walt won't accept that there might be something wrong with Matthew, and before Clementine can get all of her worries out, they are interrupted by Kenny, who's doing a check on the perimeter before the snow starts coming down too hard. As the three of them make their way around back, they stumble on someone peeping in the window. To them, she's a complete stranger, but we recognize her from day 220 of the outbreak as Bonnie. Kenny wants to shoot her right then and there, but Walt is more worried about her well-being and offers her food instead. He goes inside and grabs a box, bringing it out and wishing her well as she leaves before Clementine goes back inside so Kenny and Walt can have a word in private. On the one hand, Walt could be seen as reckless. He not only offers Bonnie food, but he's willing to let her inside the cabin and even reassures her that,
We've got plenty. You stay put. I'll be right back.
When she protests taking the food. If she is part of a group with bad intentions, they now have a perfect mark and know where to raid for supplies. On the other hand, working together and being kind is going to lead to a better future overall. While people often mistake kindness for weakness, we are only as good as we treat each other, and society can only work as a whole if we all help each other out and share resources. While Walt may be a little too open given the circumstances, his heart is in the right place and his intentions are pure. As Clementine makes her way back inside the ski lodge, she is flagged down by Luke, who's discovered a picture of Walt and Matthew that confirms Matthew was the man Nick shot. Luke wants to hide the information from both Nick and Walt, worried about how the latter will react and wanting to spare Nick from him knowing how bad his earlier mistake really was. The right thing to do is to be honest with everyone. Nick will never be able to get better if his mistakes are hidden from him. He needs to face them head on and learn from them. Walt appears to be the kind of person that would forgive a mistake even as it affected him so badly. And we don't even have to wait to tell anyone. Nick walks up as Clem and Luke are talking and you can show him the photo. He immediately wants to tell Walt to do the right thing even as Luke is still trying to keep it quiet. Clementine goes to retrieve the knife she'd found earlier from her backpack, having realized it was Matthew's, but Walt has already found it and is now on the front porch putting the pieces together. He's devastated at the loss, but his first concern is to find out whether or not Nick is a good person. He asks Clementine about the incident as Nick is coming outside, and Nick confesses while apologizing profusely. Before they can fully resolve the strife, the wind picks up and the wind turbine starts making a lot of noise as it rotates faster and faster. The group realizes the noise is a problem and hurries to shut the turbine off, with the adults in the group once more showing their ineptitude by having Clem figure out how to stop it. Thankfully, she's able to figure it out, but not before a herd of zombies shuffles out of the woods. Just as things seem like they couldn't get any worse, machine gun fire echoes all around and Carver comes out of the woods, with a small group that includes Bonnie, to save the day. Getting the group inside, he demands that Rebecca come out from wherever she's hiding and threatens to kill Carlos if she doesn't. He starts by breaking several of Carlos's fingers as Rebecca and Alvin argue about what to do. Rebecca wants Clementine to go and find Kenny and Luke, hoping they will be able to do something from outside the cabin, and Alvin wants to just surrender. The best thing to do here would be to just give themselves up. Carver to this point hasn't killed anyone, and he seems more intent on bringing them all back with him than actually hurting them. Again though, it is Clementine who has to convince Rebecca to do the right thing before things get too out of hand. But surrendering isn't the end of it, as a shot rings out, killing one of Carver's people. In retaliation, Carver grabs Walt and shoots him without hesitation before threatening to kill someone else if the shooter doesn't come out. A second shot barely misses Carver, and he quickly grabs Alvin as a human shield. As he walks toward the window with Alvin in front of him, he talks about someone named George, who he claims Alvin murdered in cold blood. But before we can get too much of that backstory, Clementine yells out for Kenny and Luke to stop shooting, and Carver realizes she might be a better pawn. Throwing Alvin down, he grabs Clem, putting a gun to her head. It's this action that finally makes Kenny surrender, and the episode ends as Carver and his group are leading everyone out of the lodge and into the night. The situation with Carver is a lot more complex than anything from Season 1, and it's going to be something we spend a lot of time in the next episode on. While it's easy to write him off as the big bad guy, it's also important to acknowledge that his actions are tied to the actions of the little group Clem has been with for the past week. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of our favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're diving back into Telltale Games' The Walking Dead Season 2, looking at Episode 3. In case you missed Season 1 or any of the other previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 3 is titled In Harm's Way, and we start out with what may be the most peaceful opening in the entire series as Clementine is staring blankly at a tree in a quiet forest. It turns out she's more enamored with the hermit sphinx moth resting on the trunk of the tree than the tree itself. As she reaches up to touch the moth, it flies away, and we hear a voice break through the peace asking,
You about done over there?
It's the voice of Troy, one of Carver's men, and the response comes from a flustered Sarah who's just finished using the restroom. It's unclear how long it's been since the end of Episode 2, but as Clem and Sarah approach the back of the nearby box truck, we can hear Carver on a radio letting his main group know that they're about 30 minutes away from home. This is where you can have your first real interaction with Carver, as he scolds you for staring and eavesdropping on his conversation. It's clear he's not in a good mood, and he can even threaten to hurt Clementine if she steals his walkie-talkie. This might be a throwaway line, or foreshadowing. As Clem and Sarah climb back into the box truck, we see the rest of the group tied up and miserable. Kenny seems to be relieved that Clementine wasn't hurt, making us wonder what exactly led to this stop on the road. The implication is that Sarah needed to use the restroom, but based on what we see, it seems odd that Carver would stop the trip just for that when they're so close to the compound. As the drive starts back up, Kenny starts trying to rally everyone against Carver, saying they need to free themselves and be ready to fight when they reach their destination. As noble as that idea is, this is one of those times where it's better to wait and see. It's becoming more and more clear that Carver isn't one to be trifled with, and the idea that they would somehow be able to overpower an unknown force when the back of the truck opens again is laughable at best. After a little back and forth, Kenny uses a broken railing to cut himself free and prepares to fight. But the idea is short-lived as the truck hits something, causing Kenny to slam face first into the back door and fall down. As Sarita is scrambling to check on him, the door opens and the group finds themselves being escorted out onto the dock as Carver's voice rings out over the PA system to let everyone know that the group that ran away has returned. Everyone except Carlos, who's being pulled away to help with some unknown issue, is led to an outdoor area where they're told they need to get some rest before what will inevitably be a long day tomorrow. This is where we meet some new folks and even catch a glimpse of a few familiar faces. Reggie is a man who tried escaping with the group when they fled. He'd been captured before even getting out of the area, and he apparently lost an arm not long after while working on the wall. We also get a glimpse of a man named Mike, who seems rather irritated at all of the noise everyone in the group is making while he's trying to sleep. And we meet a woman sitting at a picnic table who seems to be eyeing the group with suspicion more than anything. Bonnie and Troy are the guards escorting the group, and we are reintroduced to Tavia, who is responsible for recruiting the survivors at the end of 400 days. Before the group can get too comfortable, Tavia tells Alvin that Carver wants to see him upstairs, and we're left to wonder whether we'll ever see him alive again. And now we really start to get a picture of who Carver is and what he's capable of. As the group talks to Reggie, it's clear that intimidation and manipulation are the main ways that Carver keeps people in line. Reggie is living day to day with the promise that doing just a little bit more might be his ticket to freedom. He's been imprisoned in the outdoor living area the whole time the group he tried to leave with was gone, told that he would be able to earn his way back inside over time. This has led to him following everything Carver says to the letter, and to defend the man even in light of clear wrongdoing. It's a form of operant conditioning, where the desired behaviors are subtly rewarded while the undesirable actions are harshly punished. Reggie is convinced that his actions, while in the community prison, have led to him being extremely close to being released. This is reinforced by Troy telling Reggie that if he's able to keep the new group in line, he'll be on the verge of getting out, and again by Carver the next morning when he tells Reggie that he's nearly back in. If he only follows the path a little longer, he'll be back with the main group. And the in-group versus out-group theme is thick with Carver. Even as Clementine and the others are being walked in, Carver is talking about how the people that fled are part of a group that simply lost their way, and how
no one needs to forget what they did, but we do have to find it in our hearts to forgive them.
They are not part of the group. They are more or less outsiders. By keeping them separate from the rest of the group, he further pushes this narrative that they are not us. Then he goes the extra mile and makes sure the people on the inside have plenty of food and other supplies, while the outside group barely scrapes by. He's creating haves and have-nots, and he's in control of who is part of each group. The group notices Reggie is missing an arm, and he explains that he lost it well after they'd all left. He was bitten by a zombie while working outside the wall, and he only survived because they removed his arm very shortly thereafter. We don't find out if Carver was involved in this decision or not, but if he was, it was likely his way of showing the kind of power he has through what he would have played as mercy. He could have just let the outsider, Reggie, die, but he chose to help him despite the prior betrayal. After introductions are made, Kenny urges Clementine to search around for a way out. While it's understandable that he would want to escape sooner rather than later, the rush to get out is a mistake. Like when they were in the back of the truck, they don't really know much about the situation. They know that Carver is ruthless and not to be trusted, but they don't know the extent of the security measures or the loyalty of anyone on the inside. Not to mention that, while things may be rough for them in the short term, they are safe in the makeshift prison and will have food and supplies to keep them going. As the morning rolls around, Clementine finds herself being kicked awake by Troy. Carver wants a word with the group about the herd of zombies that's bearing down on the compound, and he wants to address the tension everyone is feeling about being back and locked down. As he's in the middle of praising Reggie and calling him out as an example for how the group can get back in his good graces, another manipulation tactic, Sarah starts whispering to Clementine. This interruption doesn't go unnoticed, and Carver yells at Carlos to get his daughter in line. But he isn't alright with Carlos simply asking Sarah to apologize. He expects him to smack his daughter. If Carlos were to refuse, Carver promises Troy will do it instead, meaning Carlos has to choose between hitting the young girl or letting someone else do it. Notice that Carver doesn't partake in the violence in this instance, though. He doesn't threaten to do the beating himself, rather he puts someone else up to do it. This is because, by having someone else do it, he can shift the blame for harming the girl. He can play it off as Carlos or Troy being the violent one, while he simply made sure the rules were enforced. This is a common tactic for dictators and tyrants because it keeps their hands metaphorically clean. They can shift the blame for pain that was inflicted to others and justify their actions more easily while still using violence as one of the most effective tools in their arsenal. Once the situation with Carlos and Sarah is resolved, everyone is given their task for the day. Clementine is assigned to work with Bonnie in the armory. As they load magazines, Bonnie apologizes for how she acted at the lodge. She explains that she didn't know anyone would get hurt, and she feels like the whole thing was her fault for lying to them and directing Carver to the hideout. We also learn that she was supposed to leave with Luke's group, but changed her mind in the last minute because she didn't want to lose the relative safety and security that Carver seemed to have built. For all his faults, the compound seems strong enough to weather hordes, and they have more than enough food and supplies to get by. And that brings us to an interesting thought. Back in 400 Days, we dealt with a situation where we had to decide what to do with a woman who had tried to leave the camp we were in. She was trying to take supplies, but that was almost secondary when the idea came up that she might have wound up running into another group and sharing the location of the well-stocked place she'd run away from in the past. That situation has now come full circle in the form of Luke's group leaving Carver's group. We can easily put ourselves in Carver's shoes in that instance and think about how the group that was leaving could pose a threat to the massive amount of supplies in the compound. The state of the world being what it is, was Carver actually wrong to pursue them? This is a question that is separate from whether he is fit to be the leader of any group, or whether his way of running things is right or wrong. As we'll discuss in a bit, his leadership style is definitely bad, and that was most certainly the reason Luke's group left in the first place. But Carver would have no trouble making the case to those who remained about why they needed to be brought back. After all, what if they returned to steal supplies, maybe bringing with them a small, well-armed group? And I want to point out that I keep calling it Luke's group, because Bonnie makes it pretty clear that it was Luke and Carver who butted heads. We can piece together that both men likely wanted to be the leader of the group, and both had a faction in their corner. When push came to shove, Luke decided to take those who would follow him and split off, leading to the events that we see play out in this season. And now the picture of Carver is starting to become even clearer. He wants to be in control, and he doesn't like it when anyone challenges him. Luke was a threat to that control, but he had some support behind him, so Carver couldn't do much about it. When Luke and his biggest supporters left, it gave Carver the ammo he needed to bring those who remained, like Bonnie and Reggie, back in line. Using manipulation, like telling Reggie he's almost back in the main group, and reminding everyone how good they have it there, how he is the only one who can do the hard things and keep them safe, he's managed to improve his grip on power despite the brewing rebellion. But cracks do show through, as Bonnie seems to be questioning whether Carver will make the right choices for the group after seeing him shoot Walt at the lodge. Back in the moment with Bonnie and Clem only gets a short amount of time to load ammo, as Tavia shows up to escort her up to the greenhouse, where she reunites with Sarah and Reggie to work on picking berries. The task seems pretty straightforward, but it all goes sideways when Carver shows up to find that Sarah hasn't finished her lot, and immediately turns on Reggie. Within moments, Carver is pushing Reggie up to the edge of the building and shoving him off to his death. He justifies this murder by saying that Reggie was weak and incompetent, and uses the instance as an example of what will happen to those he deems too weak to be in the group before sending Clem back down to help Bonnie. The whole thing seems almost like one big act. He's very over the top and dramatic about it, and it's clear that he wanted to send a message. Bonnie hands Clem a bucket and asks her to take it out to the guys working on the expansion, as Clementine relays what Carver did. The expansion isn't too far away, and Clem walks in to find Kenny trying to strangle Mike. He apparently didn't like that Mike was trying to tell him what to do, but before they can really settle things, a group of zombies comes bursting through the window. The three wind up fighting off the dead, with a little help from Troy, and Clem is instructed to head back to Bonnie again. But before she can return, someone grabs her from behind and pulls her into one of the stores. Doing her best to fight her attacker, she winds up biting the hand over her mouth before discovering that it belongs to Luke. He spent several days walking with barely any rest, and he's interested in helping the group escape once more. After explaining himself, he asks Clem to get him a radio and bring it back the next day. But that task moves to the back burner as Clementine is caught exiting the store by Troy, who instructs her to go see Carver. After a brief run-in with the teary Rebecca, we make our way into Carver's office to find Alvin beaten unconscious. It's clear that Carver wanted to bring Alvin as much pain as possible, and if we linger too long, we're told that we'll be next if we don't fall in line. The conversation between Clem and Carver is intense to say the least. He makes it known that he is looking for a successor, and while he will eventually expect the baby Rebecca is carrying to be that, it's clear that he wants Clementine to fill a role in his plans. I'll pick apart Carver in depth in his Friend or Foe episode, but for the moment I want to really look at what he says to Clementine, because he's using a tactic to try to convince her that is often used by dictators and tyrants alike. If Clementine tells Carver that she doesn't think Reggie deserved to die, he responds by saying that Reggie did need to be killed. His justification is that Reggie has made several mistakes that put the group in danger, and he notes that sometimes an individual needs to be killed to protect the larger group. This is Carver using an argument that essentially amounts to the ends justify the means, while obfuscating his true intentions. Basically, he's justifying his actions as being for the greater good, and using them to try to convince Clementine that he is strong. In reality, this is what makes him such a weak leader. He wants people to fear him, to be afraid of what he might do if they don't stay on his good side. This form of leadership builds distrust and always winds up being the downfall of the person in charge, because the people they are supposedly leading become unhappy and begin plotting to either leave or overthrow the leader. This is what happened when Luke's group left the compound. The split between his group and Carver hit a breaking point, and they sought to escape. We know that Bonnie and Reggie were meant to go with them, and while Reggie has started to fall into Stockholm territory, Bonnie still actively doubts Carver, even though he doesn't know it. That's why leaders like Carver are doomed to fail. There's always dissent when you try to rule with an iron fist, and if Luke and his group are questioning Carver openly, and Bonnie is doing so in private, it's reasonable to assume that others are questioning as well. He can never really trust anyone. He'll always have to wonder if the people that tell him that they believe in him mean it, or if they're just saying it to stay in his good graces. Knowing that he can't trust anyone leads to an internal unraveling. He's slowly breaking mentally, seeing traitors where they don't exist and making rash decisions like killing Reggie in an attempt to show that he's still in control. The conversation with Clementine shows that he's desperate for some lifeline, and he works hard to convince her that she is like him. He builds her up, telling her that she's one of the strong ones while everyone else is weak. And even if she rebuts him, he uses it to show how strong she is for standing up to him when no one else would. This is also why it would be rather easy for Clementine to get in his good graces and betray him later on. He's so desperate for someone he can trust and manipulate that he leans into the young girl, assuming her incapable of betraying him because of how young and impressionable she seems. After finishing up with Carver, Clementine makes her way back to the pen with the others, finding them discussing the best way to escape the compound. Kenny is arguing that they should plan on escaping when the incoming herd of zombies hits, using them as cover, but everyone else wants to wait. Luke managed to pull Mike and Kenny aside after talking to Clem, relaying his plan to them as well, and the discussion eventually leads to a plan involving getting Luke a radio and trying to find a way through the herd with his help. That plan isn't without its own set of flaws, but as they are arguing about Kenny's lack of foresight, having no idea what to do when they reach the point of needing to walk through a herd of the dead, a new voice joins the conversation. The weird girl that Clementine noticed keeping to herself the day before, Jane, pipes up and shares an idea that grosses everyone out. They can just cover themselves in guts. After Clementine endorses the idea, relaying her experience leaving the Marsh house with Lee, the plan is set in motion, and Clem is sent to retrieve the radios. Once the radios are in hand, Clem sneaks back to the yard and grabs a little shut-eye before things really kick off. The morning light finds the group debating who is going to get the radio to Luke, with Clementine being ultimately selected no matter what choice you try to make. She's expecting to spend the day with Mike and Kenny in the yard, making the task a little more difficult, but she winds up with Bonnie instead. Bonnie reveals that she's having further doubts about Carver after hearing his side of what happened to Reggie, and she agrees to let Clem sneak off to find Luke. Making her way back out to the comic store, she quickly discovers the problem. Luke is nowhere to be found. Within moments, she's being assaulted by an angry Troy who leads her, Mike, and Kenny back to the holding pen where they learn that Luke has been captured. Carver lectures everyone about the world and how disappointed he is before demanding that they return the second stolen radio. That radio is in Clementine's pocket, but before she can speak up, Kenny intercepts it and confesses to the whole thing. It's clear his intention was to protect Clementine from whatever fallout might happen, but he also seems a bit surprised when Carver starts hitting him. The beating is brutal, and it's only interrupted when Bonnie steps in and tells Carver that there's a breach that requires his attention. Once Carver is gone, she says they all need to get ready and asks Carlos to do his best with Kenny, as they need to leave that night. Nightfall brings an anxious group, with an argument over whether to actually leave being the highlight. Luke is having second thoughts, even as Bonnie has promised to open the gate for them to escape as soon as she hears the PA system going. Kenny is still out cold, Sarita is grieving, Clem and Luke are both hurt, and Rebecca is still pregnant, which all goes into the reasons not to leave column. After a lot of back and forth, and not much progress, everyone's spirits are lifted as Kenny finally wakes up and insists he's good to go. The only effect the beating appears to have had on him, in the short term at least, is to strengthen his resolve. Clementine is tasked with getting to the PA system and turning it on. After accomplishing that, she is surprised by Alvin, who is barely alive, but ready to exact some bit of revenge on Carver. He manages to get a gun from the desk, using it to shoot one of Carver's men who'd come in to shut the PA system off as Clem climbs back out of the office. Making her way to the stockroom, Clem finds the group being held at gunpoint by Carver, and she channels her inner ninja, jumping down on him and giving the group the upper hand for once. Kenny shoots him in the kneecaps before grabbing a crowbar and telling the rest of the group to wait outside. Everyone, including Clementine, has to make their own choice about whether to leave the room or stay for what is about to happen. In reality, the best thing to do would be to put a bullet in Carver and leave. But Kenny is out for revenge, and Rebecca is right there with him. William Carver has done some bad things, and his method of ruling wasn't the best. But at the end of the day, beating him isn't going to solve anything. That kind of behavior is something you would expect to see from Carver himself, and dropping to that level destroys whatever humanity those involved might have left. Yes, he needs to be prevented from ever hurting anyone again, but as we've discussed in prior episodes, there has to be lines. Executing or exiling someone for stealing supplies or breaking the rules the group has set forth is one thing. Mercilessly beating someone is on a completely different level. For that reason, I have Clementine leave the room. It's the same reason I choose not to kill the St. John brothers as Lee, or finish off the Stranger at the end of Season 1. There are some lines that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. There are some actions that should never be taken if we want to keep some inkling of our humanity intact. Once Carver is dealt with, the group has to cover themselves in guts and start leaving the area. The biggest issue they have, however, isn't the dead, as the remaining members of Carver's group are on the roof of the building, shooting blindly into the herd in the hopes of killing enough zombies to make it through. One of them winds up hitting Carlos, setting into motion a series of events that involves the group scattering and ends with Sarita being bitten. The last decision of the episode is whether to kill the zombie that bit her or cut off her arm. To see the fallout, though, we have to wait until next week. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of our favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're diving back into Telltale Games' The Walking Dead Season 2, looking at Episode 4. In case you missed Season 1, or any of the other previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 4 is titled Amid the Ruins, and we pick up right where Episode 3 left off, with Sarita being bitten as the group is fleeing Carver's compound. Things aren't looking good as Carlos has been shot, causing Sarah to flee, and the rest of the group seems to have scattered to the wind. As Sarita stands there, a look of shock on her face, we have to make a decision about whether to put our axe into the zombie or Sarita's arm. The actual decision was made at the end of the last episode, but this is where we see the fallout. Ideally, we would remove the bitten limb in the hopes of saving her life, much like how Reggie was saved. But, given the situation, that isn't going to work. Cutting her arm off in the middle of a herd of zombies will only bring more dead to attack as she screams in pain. Taking out the zombie at least gives the chance to cut her arm off later, hopefully before it's too late and when there isn't a herd surrounding her. Kenny and Mike run over after Clem takes care of the zombie, and, grabbing her hand, they take off into the herd. Clementine tries to follow, but she can't keep up and finds herself struggling to find anyone to help as she walks among the dead. We see a brief glimpse of Luke and Nick, with Nick taking a bullet to the shoulder before running off, and several moments pass before Clem finally sees a friendly face of Rebecca. As she's trying to convince Rebecca to move through the thick herd, they run into Jane, who's moving slowly and trying to keep in character as a zombie. They beg her to help them through the mess, and while she refuses at first, she finally relents and leads them out of the darkness, using a zombie as a shield. Free of the herd, Clem, Rebecca, and Jane follow a path that eventually leads them to the place where they all agreed to meet up. Along the way, however, we get a peek at Jane's thought process in the form of several comments, including hinting that Rebecca needs to walk faster or risk being left behind. Given all she's been through, and how close she is to giving birth, these comments seem callous at best. As they stop to rest, an argument breaks out between Rebecca and Jane, as the latter insinuates that they might have to consider not keeping the baby if they can't find the rest of the group, as they have no way to provide for it. On the surface, this line of thinking seems logical, albeit emotionally cold. Having a baby in the modern world is tough for a lot of people. Having one in a situation where food and resources are scarce seems impossible. But the argument also reveals a little about Jane's past, as it's hinted that her sister died at some point after the outbreak started. She seems hesitant to invest emotionally, and some of that could be tied to that loss. But learning more about Jane will have to wait, as the group finally arrives at the Civil War Memorial, finding Bonnie and Mike along with Kenny and a dying Sarita. When Clementine tries to talk to Kenny, he only throws anger back at her. He's devastated at losing Sarita, and at the moment he needs somewhere to place the blame. Clementine was near her when she was bitten, so in Kenny's mind, she was at least partially responsible. That line of thinking might not make a lot of sense logically, but grieving minds are rarely logical. After dealing with Kenny, Clem and Jane go out looking for a safe place for the group to go. This adventure winds up being more than a scouting trip, however, as Jane spends a lot of time trying to convince Clem that she is better than the group that she's with. In Jane's view, the group is falling apart, and it isn't worth the effort of trying to make things better. She seems to be pushing Clementine into leaving, setting out on her own. And that brings up something we've only lightly touched on in prior episodes. Is being in a group actually worth it? We talked a little bit about this in the 400 Days episode when we watched as the gas station group fell apart. But it isn't just that group that we've seen struggle. In Season 1, the group at the motor inn struggled to keep things together, lasting only a few strenuous months before unraveling. In that instance, a struggle for power between Kenny and Lily, coupled with a mistake by Ben, cost them the place they'd been calling home, before the group started to really disintegrate, as Lily killed either Doug or Carly before being left behind. They also lost Katja and Duck, with Chuck, Lee, Kenny, and Ben all either dying or being separated from the group in the following days. In 400 Days, we see what appears to be a rather stable group fall apart in a matter of weeks, after a disagreement on what to do with a man who was caught stealing food turns into a power struggle and a dictatorship. Then, in this season, we see the small group that Clem stumbles into fall apart as they are reintegrated into a bigger group that they'd left after it too became a dictatorship. Groups seem to fall apart before they even have a chance to establish themselves. On the other hand, being solo comes with a lot of risks when it comes to dealing with zombies and finding food. There's safety in numbers, as you have someone to watch your back, and problem solving is a lot easier when you have others to bounce ideas off of, as someone else might be seeing something in a way that you didn't see it. As a general rule, human beings are a social species, and we do best when we have others to socialize with. Being part of a community has a lot of health benefits too, as noted in a 2015 article published in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine, linked down in the description below. Quote, "From the current body of medical research, it is evident that social connection has substantial impacts in many categories of health, from weight management, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and depression. Some psychiatrists go so far as comparing social connection to vitamins. Just as we need a vitamin C each day, we also need a dose of the human moment, positive contact with other people." End quote. So being part of a group, even a small one, is important to our overall health and well-being. This would be even more true in a situation like the zombie apocalypse, where the chance of dying has risen exponentially and any benefit would be important. Just as finding food and shelter gives you an increased chance of survival, so too would having a group that you can talk to and trust. And this is where I think The Walking Dead and other fictional series gets things very wrong for the sake of drama. Civilization has been around in one form or another for thousands of years at this point. We've always faced a mix of internal and external threats when we've come together to form groups, and that wouldn't change just because what we think of as modern society has fallen. Sure, there would be those individuals who would take advantage of the lack of laws or law enforcement to do horrible things when given the chance. But overall, groups would reform and rebuild in some fashion. It would be unlikely that things would get back to what we see today anytime in the near future, but a new normal would set in and humans would adapt and overcome those challenges that arose. It's what we've done for thousands of years. The Walking Dead at its core is a story about human resilience, about overcoming obstacles and finding our humanity when all seems lost. The zombies aren't the real monsters, they're just the window dressing. In the long run, the biggest problem we would need to solve would be the fact that everyone is infected and will turn when they die regardless of bite status. This becomes an issue when it comes to people dying in their sleep or in other situations where unexpected things happen. But that's a topic better suited to another video. For now, it's enough to know that being in a group is better for your health than being solo, and that seeking out a group that you trust is a smart move. This line of thinking will drive our choices moving forward. Back on the trail with Jane and Clem, Jane begins trying to plant and cultivate the seeds of distrust of Kenny in Clementine's mind. She insists he's a liability because of the trauma that he's been through. We also get a little more backstory on Jane, learning a little about the relationship between her and her sister and providing a little more insight into how she thinks. Before we can get too deep into that though, they spot a couple of fresh zombies on the ground and spend a few minutes looting them before the muffled sound of Sarah and Luke yelling gets their attention. The voices are coming from a trailer on the other side of the fence, and as they try to narrow down their location, they come across the zombified remains of Nick. It's not entirely clear what killed him, but we can see the bullet wound from earlier in his chest, as well as what appears to be some kind of wound on his leg that could be a bite. After dealing with him and moving into the trailer park, Clem and Jane find the trailer that Luke and Sarah's voices are coming from, surrounded by zombies. They're able to temporarily distract the zombies and slip inside, but the dead quickly surround them once more, and within minutes they're fighting to find a way out as the zombies come through the front door. A skylight in the back bedroom gives them an opportunity to escape, but they are held up by Sarah, who's gone nearly catatonic after seeing her father die. Jane argues that the right thing to do is let the girl die, but is that really the right thing? We've had situations like this with the girl at the motor inn in Season 1, where it could be argued that letting someone die was the right move. There was also the girl in the street in Macon in Season 1, Episode 3, where leaving her to her fate with the zombies made the most sense in the moment. But what about when the person seems to have lost their will to live completely? Not because they were bitten, but just because they're scared and going through a tough time. Should we just give up on someone because they're struggling? Jane's argument is a practical one. Staying longer to try and convince a person who doesn't want to move that they need to leave could mean losing your own life. The instinct for self-preservation is strong, and most people would struggle to help Sarah in a real situation. But what if, instead of being in shock while zombies close in, she was passed out in a burning building? By Jane's logic, a firefighter who would run into that building to save Sarah would be stupid. She should have been strong enough to escape on her own, and if she isn't, then she obviously deserved her fate. When put in that context, it seems a little more obvious that the right thing to do here would be to do everything in our power to save Sarah. She's scared, and she's having trouble coping with everything that's happened in the past few hours, and leaving her to die would be just as bad as killing her ourselves. And this is where we can really see two main paths emerging in the story. Ask yourself what you think Kenny would do, or Lee for that matter, and you'd likely come to the conclusion that they would both say to do everything that you could to save Sarah. Kenny has a strong will to live, and he refuses to give up even when things seem hopeless. His biggest issue with losing Katja was that she, in his words, gave up. He would have done whatever it took to convince her to carry on, and he would likely do the same for Sarah. Conversely, we know what Jane says, and we can make a pretty strong case that Jane's view would fall right in line with someone else that we've recently interacted with: Carver. Carver wouldn't hesitate to leave someone behind who he felt was weak, a detriment to the group. That was his reasoning for killing Reggie. Jane has the same outlook, though she hides it under the guise of being an outcast who prefers to go it alone. Sarah does take a little convincing, but in the end, the group makes it out and back to the camp. On the way back, we finally find out what happened to Jane's sister, Jamie. She'd given up, a lot like Sarah did, and in the end, Jane had to decide whether to keep pushing her to go on or to let her die. Jane chose to save her own life as she couldn't convince Jamie to escape a bad situation. And over time, she's convinced herself that trying to save people isn't worth the effort to justify what she did in her own mind. As they get back to the group, Bonnie pulls Clem aside and asks her if she can talk to Kenny. He's gone into a nearby tent with Sarita and won't talk to anyone. He's seen as the best hope for Rebecca, as he's the only one in the group with any experience in a delivery room, and they need him to snap out of his grief. Clem enters the tent to find a heartbroken Kenny sitting next to Sarita's lifeless body. It's clear he's already done what needed to be done, but there's no indication of his state of mind until you start talking to him. He's calmed down, though he's still struggling. He feels like no matter what he does, life just won't stop hitting him. He's reflecting on the loss of Katja and Duck, and now Sarita. His purpose was protecting them, and in his eyes he keeps failing. He doesn't think he's got anything to live for, but he also can't just give up. Clem, reminding him that Rebecca needs him to help with the baby, helps light a new fire though, and it isn't long before he's out of the tent and working on a plan. Rebecca's water broke, and now time is more limited than ever. The group splits up, with Jane going to search one area and Bonnie and Mike going to another. Clementine has the chance to help both parties, and it doesn't really matter which one she helps first. Going to find Jane, she's found a building that looks like it'll work perfectly as a shelter through the birth. There's a raised platform that would be perfect at helping them watch for the dead, but one of the metal roll-down doors needs to be unlocked before they can do anything. As Jane works to unlock it, Clem spots someone coming. A young man, carrying a bag, is making his way to the tower, and Clem and Jane hide just as he makes it to the top. Going to a trash can in the open area of the tower, the man tries to stuff the bag he's carrying into it. He's having a lot of trouble and winds up spotting Clementine before he's able to fit it in. As he's pointing a gun and speaking to her, mainly in Russian, Jane sneaks up and disarms him, and he drops the bag. Looking inside, Clem sees that it's full of medicine and bottled water, and he insists it's medicine for his sister. The whole situation is incredibly tense, but the story about the medicine doesn't really add up. Why would he be trying to hide it like that? The most likely explanation is that it's stolen and he's trying to hide it from whoever he stole it from until he can come back for it. The fact that he would get as aggressive as he does with Clementine is also indicative of some deception. Why point a gun at a little girl like that and act so hostile? It would be understandable if Kenny or even Jane were the one standing there, but Clem is clearly a child and not a threat on the surface. And you have to choose whether to keep the medicine, which would be helpful for your group and especially Rebecca, or give it back to the man. This is one of those really morally gray areas. Most of us could probably agree that stealing in general is wrong. But we could probably also agree that there are exceptions where it could be justified, like stealing food to feed starving children, or taking medicine to save someone's life. The circumstances are always important when determining right from wrong, and this situation is no different. You have to weigh how much you believe what the man, Arvo, is saying and how much you need the medicine. If he's telling the truth, that it's all needed for his ailing sister, then it would be wrong to just outright steal it from him. After all, we'd probably be pretty angry if we were in Arvo's shoes and needed the medicine for someone important to us. On the other hand, if he's lying, if he stole it himself or is part of a bandit group or has some ill intentions, then taking it from him could even be an overall good thing. Maybe the group he stole it from is tracking him, and they would be thankful that we'd managed to get it back. We saw an instance in 400 Days where a man was trying to steal supplies from the group, where he even brings his group back to attack them if he's set free. How do we know Arvo isn't in a situation like that man was? Maybe he was the scout that managed to get away with the goods, and he's stashing them until he can make it back to his own group to bring them back to get more. The chance isn't worth taking, not given how desperate our group is. Taking the supplies makes the most sense. An argument could even be made for killing the man, but that option isn't available in the game. After finishing up with Jane, Clem makes her way back before going to find Bonnie and Mike. They're exploring the memorial museum, but have yet to find any supplies. Mike is dead set on finding something to take back with them, and with Clem's help they find a jacket for Rebecca and the baby, as well as a couple of 5-gallon water containers. The water doesn't come easy though, as Clementine gets stuck while trying to enter the room they are being stored in, and she might have been bitten by a zombie that was hiding there if not for Mike breaking in at the last minute. Bonnie apologizes, as she'd been the one to insist that Clementine try getting into the room, and she says that she'll never put Clem in a situation like that again. We'll revisit that in the next episode. After nearly catching a raccoon for dinner, they make their way back to the main group. As they return, they find Rebecca dealing with some major labor pains as a small group of zombies closes in. Kenny and Mike hold off the dead while everyone else makes their way to the building that Clem and Jane discovered earlier. Climbing the stairs, Clementine is shocked to discover Jane and Luke sitting in the building. It's clear they've just finished enjoying some private time, and Luke is stumbling over an apology as Kenny rounds the corner with Rebecca and Bonnie. Luke was supposed to be watching for zombies, and Kenny gives him an earful before instructing everyone to hold the dead at bay while Rebecca prepares to have the baby. Everyone who isn't giving birth or assisting goes out onto the deck. As more zombies pile up the stairs, Clementine and Luke try to block the only entrance with a cannon. But the deck winds up being a lot less sturdy than it looks, and it collapses out from under them. Sarah falls to the ground, pinned beneath some of the boards, and Jane is barely hanging on as the dead close in. As Luke tries to pull Jane up, Clem begs her to drop down and help Sarah, who is pleading for someone to free her from the wreckage. It takes some convincing, but Jane finally agrees to help the girl, dropping down and doing her best to free her. Despite her best effort, though, Jane is unable to lift the deck off of Sarah, and she has to retreat up what remains of the deck as the young girl meets a grisly end. The group manages to knock down the little bit of deck that remains attached, giving themselves a reprieve from the dead, and they soon turn their attention back to Rebecca to see what appears to be a stillborn baby resting in Kenny's hands. Everyone is shocked, but the horror turns to joy as the child takes a breath and starts to cry. The next several hours include Jane leaving, saying she doesn't want to stick around to watch Clementine die like she did with her sister and Sarah, and Kenny and Luke fighting about what the best time to move on from the observation deck is. Luke wants to wait a few days, but Kenny points out that they don't have any food and that they need to get some better supplies for Rebecca and the baby. The morning light finds the group, including a very weak Rebecca, walking along the road as snow falls around them. Kenny and Luke are fighting about whether leaving was the right decision, but before they can settle anything, Rebecca collapses. Bonnie helps her over to the side of the road and gets her a seat on an old tire as the group notices that they aren't alone. Someone has emerged from the woods just a little ways down the road and is waving to them. As he draws closer, Clementine realizes it's Arvo. And he isn't alone. A woman with a gun and a pair of armed men come out of the tree line. Their plan is to rob the group, but as a standoff ensues, it's clear that this encounter won't end peacefully. Clementine is trying to calm everyone down as tensions rise, but she's caught off guard when she looks over to see a zombified Rebecca slowly coming to. She's still holding the baby in her arms, and Clem only has a second to react. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of our favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're diving back into Telltale Games' The Walking Dead Season 2, plowing our way through the snow-covered season finale. In case you missed Season 1 or any of the other previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 5 is titled No Going Back, and that title isn't just hyperbole. The end of the previous episode was a cliffhanger for the ages, as Rebecca passed away and reanimated within moments while holding her new baby in her arms as chaos erupted in the form of a standoff between our group and a group that includes Arvo, the man Clementine and Jane stole supplies from. As the groups yell back and forth, each demanding the other drop their guns, Clementine notices zombie Rebecca coming to and fires a single round to save the baby. As that shot echoes through the countryside, a battle gets underway, with Clementine making a mad scramble for the infant, who's now laying in the middle of the snow-covered road. Arvo is desperately trying to save his sister, who was hit by someone when the gunfire started. But as Kenny grabs the young man as a hostage, she reanimates and starts coming after Clem and the crying baby. Clementine takes out the second zombie just as easily as she took out the first, and the fight comes to an end as the final member of the gang is silenced by a returning Jane. As they are reunited, Jane expresses remorse for killing the man, saying she'd never killed someone who didn't wrong her in some way or deserve it. It could be argued the man did deserve it. After all, he was shooting the group and would have killed any one of them without a second thought. But we can also examine the situation as a whole and question that assumption pretty easily. The first shot, in this instance, was Clementine firing at Rebecca to save the baby. The firefight that ensued was mainly due to the tension running high, as both groups were unwilling to compromise in any way. Yes, Clementine stole the medicine from Arvo, which could have led to the anger and even a desire to get even from him and his group. But the reality of the situation is that it could have easily been resolved if not for the egos of everyone involved. If, instead of popping out of the woods and aiming their guns, the group had explained the situation and opened a dialogue, they might have been able to work something out without the need for bloodshed. That would have required some careful diplomacy, and for people like Kenny and Luke to keep level heads, but it would have been possible. It's a lesson that we can take away for our own lives, which is kind of the point of the series to begin with. I realized recently that we haven't really talked a lot about philosophy in general, as we've spent the past 10 weeks now looking at this game from a philosophical and ethical standpoint. Often, I spend some time breaking down a character and their actions, but I don't really explain why those things matter outside of the context of the game. Philosophy is all about finding the right question to ask, digging in and uncovering the why of our actions and figuring out how we ought to do things in regards to everyday choices. Often, we can look back at things we did or said and dissect those situations to improve in the future. But sometimes, the nature of humanity is best uncovered using thought experiments. Games allow us to peek into our own inner workings through the choices and scenarios they present. We can ask ourselves why we decided to do something like save Sarah, or leave Lily on the side of the road less than a week after trying to save her father despite how he had treated us. And the answers give us a peek into how our own minds work. Maybe you normally try to do the right thing in your personal life, but you want to see how making less moral choices feels in an environment where the worst outcome is a game over screen. Maybe you just inherently want the best possible outcome for everyone in the game. By taking the time to figure out why we choose one option or another, we can learn more about ourselves and find ways to not only improve individually, but also improve the world around us. We'll expand more on the topic in future videos, but I wanted to address it here on a high level because my goal with this series is not just to break down the choices and worlds of games, but to use those things to explore topics and concepts that can normally be really dry and boring in a way that makes them a little more fun. Getting back with our group, there's a discussion about what to do with Arvo that includes Kenny wanting to just shoot him, while Luke and Mike argue to keep him alive. Arvo, for his part, says he has a house with supplies not far away, and offers to lead the group to it if they let him live. While Kenny doesn't trust him, Bonnie and the others think it's worth a shot. Jane makes the best argument, saying that it is less about trusting him and more about taking any shot that they can get to get supplies. Thinking about it logically, Jane is right. The best thing to do is let him lead the group to where he says the supplies are hidden. They can be careful about it, observing and being stealthy, and if the supplies exist, then great. If not, they can get rid of Arvo later. As they walk, Jane apologizes to Clem for leaving, and promises to not do it again. She seems genuinely sorry and even shows a bit of character growth in the form of some positivity about the group in general. Some of this seems to be centered on her view of Clementine more than anything else, but it's a step in the direction of being willing to give being in a group a try. At the same time, she points out again that Kenny might be unstable, trying to undermine him in Clementine's mind. On the one hand, he has been through a lot, but he's also shown a lot of resilience that few in his situation probably would. He's lost several people that he cares deeply about, but he's also bounced back and found a new purpose each time. After a brief stop to rest, where Clem helps Luke deal with guilt over how bad things have gotten before cleaning Kenny's eye up, the group finds themselves approaching a power substation as the sun is going down. They've been walking for hours, and Arvo says they've got a while before they reach the supposed safe house, so they decide to spend the night in the relative safety of the substation. But there's more to these scenes than just the surface level of walking from point A to point B. For instance, when Clementine and Luke are talking, he reveals a level of guilt that rarely shows through. It's a great moment for bonding and character development, but it's also a teachable moment. As Bonnie walks over and Luke tries to pretend he and Clem weren't just talking about something as deep as survivor's guilt. As Clem, you can clue Bonnie in on what was just said, but Luke gets upset with you as he didn't want Bonnie to know what was going on. This is a very common problem that a lot of people deal with after experiencing trauma. It can be hard to open up to anyone, and even if you are able to open up to someone, it's usually something that you don't want to share with others outside of the person you opened up to. But this thinking is also counter to what you need to heal. And healing after trauma would be even more important in the zombie apocalypse than it is even today. Any one person can only carry so much emotional baggage before they reach their limit, and sharing it with others can help immensely. I'm speaking from experience on this front. I spent a few years in the Army, and in 2011 I deployed to Iraq for a tour that included a lot of things I wasn't prepared for. One of the things I had to deal with when I got back was PTSD and survivor's guilt, as I served alongside several friends that never made it home. I didn't even realize what all I was dealing with until I was able to talk with a specialist later on, but one thing that helped me before even then was sharing my experience with my wife. A lot of guys I served with refused to talk about things with anyone, using the excuse that no one else could possibly understand them. But that is actually more about hubris than anything else. Opening up and sharing things with others not only helps you heal, but it builds trust. If, instead of trying to hold everything inside, Luke and even Kenny would share what they've got going on, the group would actually function a lot better. Everyone would be able to understand them, they would be able to understand each other, and they would know that they aren't alone in feeling what they're feeling. Bonnie even tries to reassure Luke before he brushes it off and Clem goes to help Kenny. Then, later on, as they are all sitting around a fire at the substation, there's another chance for group building, and you find out that it's Luke's birthday, before Bonnie breaks out a bottle of alcohol to pass around. Kenny walks off, saying he's going to guard the perimeter, when Luke makes a toast in remembrance of those they've lost. And it's the slowdown in the pacing that really makes the episode great. I want to refer back to something I said in the last episode. The Walking Dead at its core is a story about human resilience, about overcoming obstacles and finding our humanity when all seems lost. The fast-paced running from zombies, going from place to place, escaping from other groups, wouldn't actually make up a majority of the time for the survivors. Those things only take center stage in a video game because without some action, the majority of people would tune out and stop playing. And knowing about your fellow survivors, sharing things like we talked about before, would go a long way to building cohesion in the group. The more familiar you are with each other, the more likely you are to want to look out for them and trust them to look out for you. And having that group, as we also discussed in episode 4, is an overall benefit to the people in it for the social and emotional needs it fulfills. It's the little things like learning that Luke was an art history major, seeing the attempt of an adult discussion while trying to shield Clem from the details, learning that Jane broke into her parents' liquor cabinet and ate glass shards, and hearing Kenny talk about how much he regrets spending time on his boat instead of spending time with Katja and Duck, that really helps build the characters and make them feel more real. And, even though the peace in the group doesn't last, the calm is enough to remind everyone about the difference between surviving and living, as they spend a few minutes laughing about Luke and Jane's hookup. The morning light finds the group back on the road, and things are back to being tense as Luke struggles to keep up and Kenny keeps harassing Arvo. Coming into a clearing, Arvo points out the house he's been leading them to. It's a half-built mess sitting on the other side of what would normally be a decent-sized body of water. Arvo insists that you can walk across the ice, and after a fair bit of back and forth, they decide to have him lead the way as the rest of the group follows slowly. I'll point out here that following him wasn't the best idea, as there was likely no way the water had enough time to freeze over thick enough for people to safely walk on. But there isn't really any other option. For a body of water to be safe to walk on, you need temperatures well below the freezing mark for at least 2 to 3 weeks, to ensure the ice is thick enough. Arvo acts like he's walked across the ice before, but given what we've seen so far, it's unlikely the water was frozen the last time he was at the house. It took roughly a day and a half to reach the building, and the first time Clem saw Arvo was about 2 to 3 days prior to the group arriving there. It's all speculation, but at a minimum, the last time he was even at the house was likely at least 4 to 5 days before he returned with the group. The air temperature has obviously been cold, but given how long they've been outside and the fact that none of them are frostbitten, it's unlikely the temperature has gone much below freezing. And that is only a recent thing, not something that's been going on for 2+ weeks. That point aside, they follow him across the ice, but it isn't without incident as Luke falls through a weak point and finds himself barely clinging onto the surface. To make matters worse, a group of zombies is making their way onto the ice behind the group, and Luke only has a short amount of time to get out of the water before being eaten. He asks Clem and Bonnie to help him by taking out the zombies as he works to pull himself out, and we're transported back to when Bonnie, Mike, and Clem were in the museum, and Bonnie said to Clem,
"I'm sorry I asked you. I won't do it again."
Bonnie insists Clem is small enough to help Luke without falling in, and you have a choice to either go and help him or shoot the zombies. While the urge to try and save him is strong, the best thing to do is cover him while he escapes on his own. The ice isn't thick enough for his weight, let alone any additional weight. Bonnie doesn't want to accept that though, and she races over to try and help, causing the ice to break and plunging them both into the cold water. Luke makes an attempt to surface, smacking the ice from below, and Clem has one more opportunity to try and save him, but it requires her to punch a hole in the ice, which would likely plunge her into the water as well. And this is where all the practice of dealing with the hard decisions has come back to help Clementine make the call. We could go back to when she was trying to convince Sarah to get up as zombies were trying to break down the door. Or maybe to when she likely heard from Krista and Omid about how Kenny jumped down to save Krista. But how high does the risk to yourself have to be before you walk away and let someone die when your actions might have saved them? In a split second, you don't have time to make those calculations. You have to be quick. Thankfully, we have time to think it through here. Cold water isn't like zombies. While you could fight off or even block the dead with enough know-how, you can't control how your body reacts when it hits that icy liquid. If it isn't something that you're used to, or at least something you're prepared for, the cold could send your body into shock in an instant. Once that happens, you're not only unable to help the person you went in after, but now you also need to be rescued. Maybe Luke could have been saved if Bonnie hadn't gone after him, if they'd had some rope to throw him while pulling him up from a safe area. But the moment he went under, it was over. Even if they were able to get him out, the risk of hypothermia would skyrocket, and without a way to warm him up and stabilize his core temperature, he would be dead in a matter of minutes. In this situation, you have to leave Luke. Getting into the house, Kenny is irate with Arvo, who he blames for putting them in the situation that caused Luke and Bonnie's deaths, and everyone else is in a state of shock. Jane manages to find a couple of duffel bags of canned chili, showing that Arvo wasn't completely lying about having supplies, but that food isn't going to solve all of their problems, and before long, Kenny is working on getting a pickup truck that he finds outside working, in the hopes of continuing north to look for Wellington. And this is where Jane and Kenny really start to get at each other. Kenny gets a little more hands-on with Arvo than he probably should, and Jane starts looking for ways to fire Kenny up. Let's take a step back though, because we're really getting into the deepest part of the episode. The night before, around the campfire, Jane was starting to open up a bit, and even seemed to be warming up to the idea of being in a group. She'd come back after leaving the first time, mostly because of Clementine, but also because she was starting to feel like a part of something, and because of her connection with Luke. There may have even been a budding romance there, with the limited options in the world probably contributing to that. Less than 24 hours later, Luke goes into the water with Bonnie, and neither one comes back up. In one foul swoop, Jane not only lost someone she'd started to draw closer to, but she also realized he and Bonnie were closer than she considered. Because of that, she went back into the safe place in her mind where being in a group is bad and her instincts kick in. The only reason she didn't leave right then and there was because of Clementine, who she saw as a surrogate little sister. At that point, Jane decided that the best course of action would be to drive a wedge between Clementine and Kenny, who she knew were close, by finding ways to get under his skin and pointing out to Clem every mistake that he made as an example of his unraveling. Kenny makes this even easier as his brash actions and anger issues provide plenty of fodder for Jane's cannon. And the dire situation in the house just makes things worse. Throughout all of this, Mike is warming up to Arvo, and the two are making their own plans in the background. The group is falling apart, and it's becoming more and more clear that Clem is going to have to make a choice. Kenny gets one of the trucks behind the building working, with Mike and Jane coming out to argue with him about where they should take it, before they all decide to wait for morning light to leave. Kenny isn't happy with waiting, but Clementine is able to calm him down as they sit in the truck and have a conversation about everything from what Lee might say in the situation to whether Wellington is even real. At one point in the conversation, Kenny brings up how he felt about Clementine choosing to sit with Luke and his group back in the lodge. He says it made him feel sad, but he also felt incredibly proud of Clem as her choice to sit with them showed just how much she was growing up. And this conversation in general reveals a more sentimental side to Kenny that is going to be really great to dive into in his Friend or Foe episode. It shows how much even the smallest things have an impact on him, for better or worse. It also shows how his outlook, even with all the bad things that have happened, is still one of hope. He chose to be proud of Clementine rather than hold a grudge against her. He chooses to hope that someone out there has managed to make something work. He's ready to move forward and do what's right for Clementine and AJ, despite everything that's happened. Leaving the truck, the pair heads inside with the rest of the group to try and rest. But Clementine finds herself waking up at some point in the night to the sound of something hitting outside the window. A cord is blowing in the wind, smacking up against the house. But as she goes outside to remedy the issue, she finds Mike and Arvo in the process of stealing the truck. Mike is trying to keep things calm, but Arvo's been waiting to get back at Clementine ever since she stole his bag, and he winds up shooting her as Kenny and Jane come running out to see what's going on. As the screen goes black, Kenny's voice fades further and further into the distance. But it isn't Kenny's voice anymore, it's Lee. He's waking Clementine up as they ride in the RV, telling her that she was just having a bad dream. I'm going to be completely honest here and say that the first time I played this episode, a part of me was hoping that Lee was telling the truth. Maybe the whole thing had been a dream, and we'd get the chance to play as Clementine, but Lee wouldn't get bit this time and things would work out better. Alas, that was just as much of a dream. The sequence itself, at least in my head, is Clementine reliving a conversation we didn't get to see from Season 1. It's also a way for her to process everything that's happened and work through things in her own way. After a brief talk, she falls asleep leaning against Lee before waking up to find herself in a different moving vehicle. Kenny is driving and Jane is trying to spot for him as snow is falling outside. After shooting Clem, Mike and Arvo took off into the woods. Kenny and Jane checked on her before loading her and AJ into the truck, leaving before anyone else could try to steal it. As they barrel down the freeway, Kenny and Jane argue about where they should go, and Jane spends a considerable amount of time riling Kenny up. Just as the arguing is hitting a crescendo, a pileup of cars ahead of them in the snow gets Kenny's attention, and he slams on the brakes, somehow avoiding hitting anything as the truck finally comes to a stop. The first thing Kenny does is check that everyone, including Jane, is alright. Jane wants to keep moving, but Kenny is worried about the fuel situation and decides to go check and see if he can find a vehicle that might have some diesel left in the tank. Climbing out, he tells them to meet him at a nearby rest stop if anything goes wrong, and disappears into the snowstorm. Jane tries to talk Clem into leaving, but they are interrupted by the sound of gunfire before zombies start making their way out of the pileup. Jane starts the truck and tells Clem to hit the gas, but that only helps them get a short way before the truck is stuck in a ditch. Jane gets out of the truck, leaving Clem behind and running into the storm with AJ. After escaping herself, Clem wanders through the storm for a bit before finally finding the rest stop with a worried Kenny inside. Kenny is frustrated that Jane took AJ, but that frustration turns to panic as Jane finally shows up without the baby. She isn't clear on what happened, and before long, Kenny is going back out to look for him. As he runs out, Jane pulls Clementine aside and tells her to just sit back and ignore whatever happens. She refuses to say anything else, and as Kenny runs back in, it's clear he thinks the worst has happened. The two wind up fighting, and things get really bad before Kenny finally gets the upper hand. He's on top of her, trying to force a knife into her, and Clementine has the option to shoot Kenny or let him stab her. But what's the right thing to do? The truth is, this is one of the most complicated decisions of the season, because the final outcome, how each character acts, depends heavily on the choices Clementine has made throughout the season, and even reaches back into Season 1 with how Lee got along with Kenny. On the surface, Jane makes some good points about Kenny and his anger issues. He is quick to jump to conclusions, makes unilateral decisions, and seems to hate anyone that doesn't want to go along with him in every situation. But he's also shown himself to be very loyal to those he considers family, and is willing to put the needs of the group first even when he isn't happy with the other members. Jane, on the other hand, has got a lot going on herself, and is just as dangerous in her own way. She started to collapse internally since Luke died, using that instance as confirmation of her opinion that being with a group brings nothing but pain. It's a state of mind she's not even aware of, but does it warrant her death? To complicate matters, we don't know in the moment what happened to AJ. The only information we have is that Kenny went out and came back as if he found something, and we're left to wonder what she could have done. Could she be capable of causing AJ's death? With the given information, letting Kenny win makes the most sense. Even if we've disagreed with him, gone against him, and think he's unhinged. For one thing, Jane told us not to intervene. For another, neither of them needs to really die, and by shooting Kenny, we would become an active participant rather than a passive bystander. It's also worth pointing out how shifty Jane was when Kenny was looking for AJ. She won't say anything about the baby's whereabouts, and even goes as far as saying,
You have to trust me. You're gonna see what he really is.
while telling Clem to stay out of things. The only context where that makes sense is if she did something really bad in another attempt to rile Kenny up and push him over the edge. After stabbing Jane, Kenny's main concern is that AJ is gone. He seems to be in complete disbelief about the whole thing, but that only lasts a short while as the cry of an infant carries over the sound of the wind and snow. Making their way to a nearby car, they find AJ safe and sound in the back seat, and it becomes clear what happened. Jane hid the baby and then hinted that he was dead, just to push Kenny to his breaking point. She could have, at any time before things got out of hand, told him AJ was alright, but she chose to allow the fight to continue. Not only that, she knew what all Kenny had been through with Katja and Duck and then Sarita, and how important family and the baby was to him, and she still thought that pretending AJ was gone was the right thing to do, all to prove a point while trying to manipulate Clementine. Even through all of that, you have another choice to make. Do you stay with Kenny or go it alone? Kenny hasn't shown himself to be a danger to Clementine or AJ. In fact, he's shown that he's willing to kill to protect them. Because of that, it makes the most sense to stick with him. But that isn't the end of things either. 9 days later, we find a tired Kenny carrying AJ and walking alongside Clementine as they approach a pillar of smoke rising just above a hill. Racing up the slope, they find themselves face to face with a large wall, and the spark of hope they've been holding on to grows. But as they walk up, a gunshot rings out and a bullet hits the ground at their feet. A voice tells them to hold and drop their weapons before asking them to approach the gate. A woman standing guard confirms they've reached Wellington, but as she drops a bag of supplies, she informs them that the community is full. In a moment that shows Kenny's true character, he steps up and begs the woman to just take the kids. He's willing to walk away, but he needs them to be safe. After a few moments, the woman says she'll go ask someone and walks away as Clem questions Kenny, and he insists that her and AJ need to stay there. And staying is the right call, but the reason for that is better suited to Kenny's upcoming Friend or Foe episode. I've mentioned it a couple of times and it's coming in a few days. I wanted to wait until Kenny's story had ended to dive into him as a person and character, and this episode is the end of his tale, no matter which choices you made. And I'm curious to hear what choices you did make in the comments down below. Did you wind up with Kenny or Jane, or were you alone? Did you make it to Wellington, or did you end up going somewhere else? Next week, we're going to be starting on Season 3, and we'll be finding out whether Kenny is a friend or foe. We'll also be diving into Jane's story in another Friend or Foe episode that you're not going to want to miss. The best way to keep up with everything is to subscribe to the channel, and liking the video is always appreciated as well. If you want early access and info on projects and other things before they come out, you can join as a channel member or head over to Patreon, where I've got a ton of stuff to check out. That's all I've got for now. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
When he's old enough, you make him wear it. It'll keep the sun out of his eyes. That's important. All right. Good. Keep an eye out for him. Please. Now, you take care of Alvin here. You live a good life, okay? Don't waste this, okay? Now, I'm gonna go before one of us changes their mind. Now, I'm gonna walk away, and I might not look back. Not because I don't want to. I'm real glad to have met you, Clementine.